synagogue or mosque, etc. People are learning, a child raised in a culture is learning these deep values, and indeed crime and punishment will be one lesson, one pedagogy for teaching those values. But that is essentially what makes us a society. And this, again, going back to the Dreyfus Affair and the debates between French liberals and French conservatives. This is a very important point for Durkheim. One of the reasons that sociology, although it often is derived, especially Durkheim sociology, is viewed to have a very conservative aspect to it, and we'll come back to why people think that, it actually is a forceful defense of liberalism. What he's really saying is to his own contemporary conservatives who are on the other side in the Dreyfus Affair, who are saying basically French society is endangered by diversity, by having too many different kinds of people who don't believe the same faith. What we need to do is get back to a kind of ethnically pure France if we're going to be stable. He's saying, don't worry, we're individuals, but because we come up in the same social institutions, we are actually being inscribed in us is a shared consciousness. That means that even though we may not have a heavy-handed state ruling us, and liberalism is partly about less state power, right, both in the economy and in everyday life, that's not going to lead to chaos because people aren't just responding to fear, they're responding to these shared values. And this will really distinguish Durkheim in sociology from, say, Beccaria and Bentham in the economics school, right? Because for the economists, society only exists at any one moment because it's in the self-interest of the individuals involved, and therefore you need a heavy punitive system to deter people from essentially exiting the game when it's to their short-term advantage. And you need all kinds of rewards to keep them doing pro-social things when you want them to do. Durkheim, in the sense, saying markets are great, but they're just one form of this sense of social solidarity. Indeed, he wants to say, markets are themselves good examples of social interdependency. We go to markets and we can buy things that we can't ourselves produce, but only because we have a shared currency and we have shared practices of negotiating. And these things don't just come in a manual somewhere, right? You learn them when you go to church, when you go to school, when you play with your Barbie dolls as a child, etc. You're getting this kind of worldview put into you. Now, this takes Durkheim again to a kind of general theory of crime that is actually, I think, quite strong and quite robust. Most crimes, again, if you're peeling through the California Penal Code, he would expect most crimes reflect the generality of social condemnation of a common consciousness that you violate. Now, and punishments, he's going to say, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, are proportionate to this condemnation, something that we also saw the psychologists arguing, that people have this intuitive sense that punishment ought to be relatively proportionate, and he thinks that this is a good piece of evidence for the idea that punishment is really about satisfying this moral sense of violation rather than a utilitarian calculus that might lead to a much longer punishment, much more disproportionate. And even, and this comes at the end of part one of his chapter, he takes on what might seem the most striking contradiction to his theory, how he anticipates being asked, can you account for the fact that there's so many crimes that don't raise moral opprobrium? And he's thinking here of what I was getting to the other week when I put up a slide of, say, somebody smoking medical cannabis, and even somebody who looked like an appropriate medical cannabis patient, sort of an aging, sick-looking guy like me, rather than a robust young person who's clearly just having fun. This is a sympathetic person, even if federal crime, perhaps, to be using medical marijuana, even in California, but it doesn't defend most people. Certainly the person who's using it to gain their appetite back against chemotherapy or AIDS, drugs, etc., is not going to generate a lot of moral outrage in people. And we can think of lots of other crimes that are like that, whether it's a parking ticket for parking in a certain kind of zone, lots of different kinds of laws. He even evokes the famous examples that we use in law school, hypotheticals of hunting out of season. If you go hunting out of season, that's a crime typically, although it doesn't morally offend most people inherently. They might be offended by hunting generally, but it might not offend them that you're hunting out of season. So how do we explain this, Durkheim says? Well, these kind of laws, Durkheim suggests, are not, we could view them as just an exception, like we've got these core crimes and then we've got these kind of regulatory offenses that we just sort of added to the penal code because we couldn't think of anywhere else clever to put them. He thinks that he's got a stronger explanation. He says these crimes also reflect a sense of moral censure, but it's being mediated in this case by the state. Because once you have an organized society, he says, you don't need a state to have a society, because that's part of what you get when you have a common consciousness, even if you don't have a fortress or a king or a parliament. But once you do create a state, that state, in a sense, becomes the agent of society, becomes and this is a very Hegelian notion that the state is a kind of embodiment of society acting for itself. And Durkheim thinks that we believe that that's why we are loyal to the state. This is essentially a theory of legitimacy. In some ways, Durkheim is giving us a sociology of the political here, and understanding how people can be loyal to a state, apart from just receiving goods and services from that state in a sort of rational actor mode. And what he wants to suggest is that at the end of the day, we develop a kind of sentimental attachment to the state, because it is associated with this moral common consciousness. And therefore, when the state is affronted by our disobedience of these regulatory laws, we do feel a kind of moral anger. It may be a little less intense than when we see something that directly violates our common consciousness, but nonetheless it's there. And a good example of that would be somewhat the way people feel about people who violate what we think of as kind of classic white-collar crimes, especially where there's not a clear individual victim, somebody who engages in insider trading, for instance. There's a sense that they have violated they're not playing by the rules, and that itself is a kind of a moral condemnation of them. So let's talk about punishment now, because then that comes sort of in part two of his chapter. He develops a theory of punishment that goes along with his theory of crime. And as I said, this fits right into the discussion we were having last week, because Durkheim is observing that there's a vigorous debate among legal theorists and criminologists in his own day about the purposes of punishment. He says nowadays the question is raised as to whether this kind of condemnation he's been talking about is rational, right? Does it fit with these rational 19th century ideas about how we ought to punish to get some reduction in crime, and whether it would not be wiser to look upon crime as a mere sickness or error, right? That sort of incapacitation or rehabilitation thinking. But he says we need not launch into such discussions, for we are seeking to determine what is or has been, not what should be. And he says the real nature of the facts we have just established cannot be disputed. And what he goes on to suggest is that there's a kind of, even in modern France of 1893, when punishment is supposed to be about social defense, deterrence, incapacitation, etc., it's really got a hidden agenda. He says the nature of a practice does not necessarily alter because the conscious intentions of those implementing it are modified. It may be that modern criminologists and legal theorists only want to talk about punishment as a form of utilitarian social defense, but that doesn't mean that its real nature has changed. Punishment, he says, adapts itself to the new conditions of existence created for it without thus undergoing any essential changes. This is what has happened in the case of punishment. And he goes directly to this issue of sort of suffering and pain associated with retribution. After all, if punishment is really about deterrence or incapacitation, we don't really need to hurt people, right? We could show somebody being tortured on TV, but it could be fake, designed to intimidate people, but not really have to torture the person. Or we could incapacitate people in luxury sort of resorts so that they actually weren't suffering at all, but they were simply removed from society. And that would sort of serve these utilitarian functions. But notice Durkheim is suggesting that's not true. When we look at how punishment is done in France in 1893, and I might add in California in 2012, even though it talks about rehabilitation and deterrence and incapacitation, there's all this pain associated with it. And for Durkheim, he's got a really interesting insight. While everyone else is running around saying, oh, that pain is kind of an unfortunate residue of our traditional backward ways, and if we ever could reform punishment, if we ever had enough of a budget in the Department of Corrections, we could sort of solve these little problems with our essentially rational utilitarian penal system. And Durkheim's saying, no. The point is, whatever else we think we're doing, we are actually trying to hurt other people as a reflection of this moral outrage, and however you try to frame it, even if you call the building a correctional institution, even if you fit it out with Brita hydration stations and nice colored coordinated carpeting, etc. At the end of the day, it's still about punishing people. And so for Durkheim, making that point is a very contrarian point and a very important one, and one that has in many respects been vindicated by the history of the 20th century, where this long period of celebrating rehabilitation then was followed in our own time by a return to extremely punitive approaches. And Durkheim, of course, would not have been very surprised by that. Now, the other thing that's really important about Durkheim's theory of punishment, and again, it runs right into the teeth of this whole rational debate in the 19th century about retribution versus deterrence, etc., is that for Durkheim, punishment is about emotions. And this should be, some of you may be interested in law and the emotions. It's a very hot topic right now. Durkheim is in many ways the father or grandfather of law and the emotions, because although most legal scholars and most sociologists, for that matter, have assumed that the legal system is primarily about rationality, right? Law and economics will tell you that all of our legal rules are really rational ways to create efficient markets, and punishment is an example of that in terms of deterrence. And Durkheim's saying, oh, no, it is about emotions. In the first place, punishment constitutes an emotional reaction. And again, primitive societies are his example. Indeed, primitive peoples punish for the sake of punishing, causing the guilty to suffer solely for the sake of suffering, and without expecting any advantage for themselves from the suffering they inflict upon it. Thus, if, after having destroyed the one who was the most immediate cause, some strength of feeling still remains, quite automatically it reaches out even further. But Durkheim says, don't think that this is only true of primitive, again, pre-modern societies. He says, look at modern French justice, and we might say, look at modern American justice. It is emotions that both prosecuting and defense counsel address. The latter seeks to arouse sympathy for the guilty person, the former to stir up the social sentiments that have been offended by the criminal act. So he's telling us that no matter how much you might hear from some of my academic colleagues that punishment is really about rational objectives, never forget that its core is emotions. And that this is just as true in modern society. Of course, we can see it more easily in primitive society, where there isn't dressed up with lots of trappings of rationality. But if we go inside the courts of justice, right, where all that rationality is supposed to be enshrined, what we see is trained advocates who are stirring up emotions. And of course, this is one of the things I think you may find interesting about law school, is that we, even though lawyers actually, I think Durkheim's correct, have to be very good at managing emotions, including their own, we don't teach that, right? I mean, that's not, you won't find courses on sort of managing the emotions of the jury. I mean, we probably should offer courses on that. We require a very different kind of curriculum. So at the end of the day, Durkheim is looking around at France at the turn of the 19th, 20th century that thinks of itself as a cutting-edge progressive society. It's replaced forms of outdoor torture on the scaffold with modern prisons, and in this case, Devil's Island. And that actually is an illustrated newspaper that's supposed to be depicting Dreyfus on his on Devil's Island. Again, it doesn't look all that bad. It looks like a slightly tropical setting. He's certainly not at hard labor there, and it may be a somewhat vulgarized image of what Devil's Island really looked like. But the point is, even if this is true, even if this is accurate as to what Devil's Island was like, that was sort of a genteel resort-like setting where you were kind of kept out of society, Durkheim would remind us, look for the pain, look for the emotion. It may be that this isn't as bad as you expected, but then go back and remember the moment when Dreyfus had his military honors stripped off his uniform in front of a large audience. There's always going to be this humiliating, vengeance-oriented aspect to punishment. And this then brings him to a comprehensive definition of punishment, right? We had a comprehensive definition of crime. It's whatever evokes the sort of sense of outrage in people. And what is punishment? He says punishment constitutes a reaction of passionate feeling, graduated in intensity, which society exerts through the mediation of an organized body over those of its members who have violated rules of conduct. And this is on page 52 of the reading. So he makes a couple points about punishment here, right? One is that it is passionate. It's not primarily rational. It's emotional and passionate. It is variable. We shouldn't expect every punishment to be the same, because, after all, it's not a response to danger or risk, even if we want to think of it as that. It's a response to this emotional turning point. He has a very interesting contrast here, which I just wanted to point to briefly in his in this section in part 2, where he contrasts, in effect, the person who's been convicted of a crime with a person who is an enemy. And he says that with a person convicted of a crime, we don't feel it's necessary to punish him or her to the nth possible degree. We only want to punish them in a way that's proportionate to the outrage that we feel about the crime they've committed. But he says when it comes to the enemy, he says, there's no precaution that's too great when dealing with an enemy. And it's a very interesting observation I want to just highlight for you now, because arguably, certainly since 9/11, right, many people think that our security system essentially is all about enemies rather than about criminals, and that therefore there's no limit to what we'll do to protect ourselves. And we might even think that, as I argue in Governing Through Crime, that to some extent the war on crime, starting in the 60s, was a shift from a sort of penal justice model to a kind of warlike model where the criminal becomes an enemy. And I want you to keep that in mind as we think about how we ended up with such a heavily disproportionate punishment system. But nonetheless, for Durkheim, this has got to be variable, and it's done by society. This is something that I'm going to turn to in a second. For Durkheim, it's a mistake to think that punishment is about individual responses to crime, right? That's the psychology story. Instead, he says there is always a kind of socially organized quality to crime, to punishment, even when it's being done in traditional societies by the people themselves. It's not an individual story; it's a social story. So let me just sort of let that definition sit there for a moment, and just throw out, just to kind of invite you to begin to think with these, rather than treat them as some kind of truth in itself. Right? This is a question, in a sense, that you can use, or a hypothesis, a model that you can use and apply to the real world, and see if it brings interesting things back, or if it highlights contradictions. So the question I would ask, just to maybe have a brief discussion about this, is what would Durkheim say, or how would Durkheim, using this definition of punishment, analyze the punishment of Jerry Ewing that we talked about last week when we talked about the 3 strikes case? Right? Just to remind you, Jerry Ewing was the protagonist in Ewing versus California, who had been sentenced to 25 years to life in prison under the 3 strikes law for an immediate offense of having stolen 3 golf clubs worth about $1,200. He did have a series of burglaries and other property, but creepy, what I call last time creepy property crimes, on his record, and he gets 25 years to life. So what's one to say about that? On the surface, it certainly went to the court on the theory that it wasn't a proportionate punishment, and while the court ended up affirming it, it affirmed it under a theory of, well, it's not grossly disproportionate, when grossly disproportionate is epitomized by the death penalty for a parking violation. Okay, well, it's not that disproportionate, but it still looks pretty disproportionate. So what do you think Durkheim would say about a punishment like the punishment of Jerry Ewing? Yeah.
I think maybe he might say that societal reaction in passing that law and of what maybe they believe the criminal justice system is supposed to be doing, which was punishing them, fixing them.
I think it's a good intuition, and one that actually kind of takes us a step beyond Durkheim's immediate theory here, because in a sense you're suggesting people can have a moral response not just to crimes, but in some ways to the failure of a criminal justice system to deal with crimes. And go back to the crime that, in a sense, didn't give rise to the three strikes law, but probably gave it its political viability, and that is the kidnapping and murder of Polly Klaas, right? Now, the kidnapping and murder of Polly Klaas is a crime that, in a classic Durkheimian sense, would certainly seem proportionate to a life sentence, right? I mean, it's a horrendous crime of the sort that if you're going to fear any crime befalling your family, it's going to be that kind of a crime, right? So if what's his name, Richard Allen Davis, was convicted of Polly Klaas's murder and is actually on death row, we're sent to life in prison, which he essentially has been, with the possibility, remote possibility of being executed. Durkheim would be perfectly comfortable. So the problem we're left with is, how to then explain the application of that very harsh punishment to Ewing. Now, one explanation is that this is in some ways a more complicated kind of penal process than Durkheim was describing, but not one that's incompatible with his ideas, and that is people's outrage that led to the three strikes law was not just an outright outrage at particular criminals. It was also an outrage at a legal system that they saw, not necessarily accurately, but that they saw as not responding adequately, right? And so three strikes is intended as a punishment to criminals, but it's also kind of, if not a punishment of the state, at least a kind of rebuke or reprimand to judges and other people that may have, in the view of voters, been too lenient in their treatment of past crimes. What else might Durkheim say? Yes?
I would say that Durkheim wouldn't be surprised because, in my opinion, he would see it as it is a crime to commit so many felonies and misdemeanors, especially because Ewing has quite a record going back into prison for a number of things. It's not just the creepy crimes. There's lots of stuff that he did within 3, 4, 5 months of being out of jail. So I think that Durkheim would say that that it's understandable that three strikes was implemented because of the fact that the crime was that he was doing so much. Besides, I don't think he would see it as a veteran because obviously it's not him doing committing another misdemeanor, but for Durkheim it would make total sense because he would say it's a proper response to someone who is not stopping when he should have stopped a while ago.
I mean, the whole category of recidivism offenses, which you're analyzing here, and you're suggesting, which the Supreme Court does as well, that when we look at Ewing, not so much as based on his offense of most immediate conviction, but as a recidivist, as a career criminal, as somebody who sort of keeps committing these crimes, he takes on a quality that may evoke greater moral outrage. Now, partly this, in some ways, reconciles Durkheim with more utilitarian forms of criminology, because, as we alluded to last week, sometimes the people we fear, our fear of people can easily be turned into a sense of outrage, a moral outrage at them, right? And also, again, we may think about the role that state actors play, right? So when you hear prosecutors defend the three strikes law, part of what they'll say is, look, this law gives us discretion to select those repeat offenders who may have committed a minor crime now, but who we know, based on our experience with their criminal history, are likely to be really serious criminals, are deserving of greater punishment. And if you trust us, then we're able to do justice to this. And we might take that as an example of Durkheim's point that the state itself, and in this case prosecutors, who are probably the one part of our state or formal political state in America that is generally sort of popularly praised. I mean, people don't like the government very much, but they tend to like prosecutors as a model of government, that they then take on a kind of moral legitimacy that will allow the people they choose as bad guys to also be seen as more deserving of punishment, perhaps, than others. So I think this is an interesting kind of a crime that in some ways, or a sentence, if you will, a punishment that challenges in some ways Durkheim's theory, but as I think we've illustrated here, there's a number of ways of reconciling them. And we might finally suggest it also poses a question, and it's a question that some of you may want to write on for your paper, which is, because this year we're probably going to have an initiative on the ballot to reformulate the three strikes law. So you might ask yourself, from a Durkheimian point of view, is the three strikes law vulnerable precisely because it doesn't fit very comfortably with people's moral intuitions? When they thought about Richard Allen Davis, they thought, sure, he deserves 25 years to life. They weren't really thinking about Gary Ewing. If we put Gary Ewing in front of them on the ballot, they may vote this down, and so, or vote to reform the law. So there's a number of, from a number of point of view, this is just one. The three strikes law and its potential amendment this year could be a bonanza for Legal Studies 160 paper writing. Okay, so just briefly, this leads Durkheim to address something that's very important in the literature of the history of punishment, maybe not so important today, but this notion that punishment evolves from the vendetta, right? There was a long history in Europe and in other places of private vendettas, essentially clans or families taking vengeance on each other for various real or perceived injuries and insults. Many of his contemporaries thought that the modern penal system was a sort of socialization of that private right of vengeance. You might also recognize here some of the logic of social contract theory. Each of us has a right to sort of vindicate our own right to vengeance, and we sort of trade that in for a public justice system for the benefit of living and security of the state. Again, Durkheim actually rejects that. He says vendettas reflect a punitive impulse, but they're actually an imperfect or incomplete form of punishment. And I think his essential point here is that punishment is deeply social from the ground up. It doesn't have to be socialized by the state. It is social from the ground up. The moment you see a community beginning to punish is a moment you can, in effect, establish that there is a common consciousness that is formed, that is in existence, and this is the core of the social. And as sociologists, as people who study the social,